the neon-lit, unforgiving streets of New York, some people are born to rule, and others are born to serve. Tasha Williams is a woman living in the shadows of the city's skyscrapers, working 3 jobs to protect what little her family has left. With a sister studying by candlelight and a father trapped behind bars for a crime he didn't commit, Tasha is an invisible ghost in a red and white uniform, until the night she is forced to step into the blood-stained world of the criminal elite. A single shift at the Gilded Cage, an underground casino where the city's most dangerous men gamble with lives, was supposed to be her ticket to saving her family home. But the night takes a lethal turn when she catches a glimpse of a betrayal hiding beneath the velvet poker table. Marco DiLorenzo, the Iron King of the Mafia, is seconds away from a trap he doesn't see coming. In a moment that shatters the silence of the high-stakes game, Tasha chooses defiance over subservience. She doesn't just serve a drink, she lunges, taking down the most feared man in the city to save his life. Facing the cold barrels of a dozen guns, she gambles her own life to expose the truth. What Marco DiLorenzo does next will do more than just pay the bills. It will blow your mind and ignite a transformation that no one in the underworld saw coming. Hello, family. Welcome to Afro Soul Mafia Stories. Before we proceed to the story, I would love to know where you are watching from. Kindly drop it in the comments section and also like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Thank you. Now let's continue with the story. The heavy iron doors of the Gilded Cage swallowed the sounds of the New York night, replacing the distant sirens of the Bronx with the muffled, rhythmic thrum of deep bass and the clinking of high-end crystal. Tasha Williams adjusted the collar of her red and white uniform, feeling the frayed hem of her skirt scratch against her thigh. The fabric was thin, washed so many times it had lost its crispness, a stark contrast to the thick, velvet-lined walls of the entryway. As she stepped further into the main floor, the sensory overload hit her like a physical weight. The air smelled of expensive cigars, aged bourbon, and a scent she had come to associate only with the ultra-wealthy, the smell of crisp, uncirculated banknotes. Massive chandeliers dripped with real diamonds, casting fractured, golden light across the sea of emerald-topped tables. Men in hand-stitched silk tuxedos laughed with a jagged edge, their diamond cufflinks catching the light every time they raised a glass, while women draped in furs and shimmering gowns glided past her as if she were a piece of the furniture. Tasha felt smaller than she ever had. In her world, gold was something you pawned to keep the lights on. Here, it was the color of the trim on the baseboards. She gripped her serving tray tight, her knuckles turning a lighter shade of brown. Every time a patron glanced her way, their eyes slid off her with a practiced indifference. To them, she wasn't Tasha, the woman who stayed up until 2:00 a.m. helping her sister with algebra, or the daughter who spent her lunch breaks at the city jail whispering through a glass partition. She was just the help, a dash of faded red and white moving through a golden world. She navigated the floor with the practiced agility of someone used to dodging trouble. She passed the high-limit baccarat tables, where the stakes on a single hand could have paid off her father's legal fees 10 times over. The sheer waste of it made her stomach churn. People threw down chips representing thousands of dollars with less thought than she gave to buying a gallon of milk. "Watch it, sweetheart," a man hissed, his breath smelling of expensive gin as she swerved to avoid his elbow. He didn't even look at her face. His eyes were fixed on the cards, his brow furrowed in a greedy desperation that seemed out of place in such luxury. Tasha didn't apologize. She couldn't afford to lose her temper, but she wouldn't bow her head either. She kept her chin parallel to the floor, her eyes scanning for her station. As she approached the private VIP lounge at the back, the area cordoned off by heavy gold chains and guarded by men with shoulders the size of refrigerators, the atmosphere changed. The frantic energy of the main floor died down, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. This was the cage within the cage. Here, the players didn't shout or cheer. They moved with a quiet, lethal precision. Tasha took a deep breath, the name tag on her chest rising and falling. Behind those curtains sat the reason the city stayed awake in fear. She smoothed her apron one last time, tucked a stray coil of hair back into her bun, and stepped into the den of the Iron King. The transition was absolute. She left behind the noise of the desperate and entered the silence of the powerful, unaware that within the hour, the uniform she wore would be stained with more than just spilled drinks. The silence did not descend all at once. It rippled outward from the entrance of the VIP lounge like a sudden freeze over a lake. Tasha felt the change in the air before she saw the cause, a heavy, magnetic pull that drew every eye toward the doorway. The men who had been whispering over their cards straightened their spines, and the women shifted uncomfortably in their designer silks. Then he appeared. Marco DiLorenzo didn't just walk into a room, he possessed it. He was a tall, imposing silhouette against the golden light of the casino, his presence so dense it seemed to suck the oxygen from the corner of the lounge. His tailored black suit was a masterpiece of intimidation, every line sharp enough to cut, framing a muscular build that spoke of violent discipline. His face was a landscape of chiseled stone, a strong jawline, a straight, aristocratic nose, and eyes the color of a winter sea that looked through people rather than at them. As he moved toward the central mahogany table, the clicking of his Italian leather shoes was the only sound in the room. He took his seat at the head of the table, his posture aggressive and regal. His hands splayed across the green felt near a mountain of high-value chips. The gold of his watch flashed under the chandelier, a subtle reminder that he owned the time and the lives of everyone in the building. Tasha felt her heart hammering against her ribs, but she forced her hands to remain steady as she approached with her tray. This was her assigned station. This was the man who held the keys to the city's darkest secrets. As she drew near, the smell of his expensive, spicy cologne hit her, a scent that smelled like old money and fresh danger. "Whiskey, neat," a voice rasped from across the table, but Marco remained silent, his gaze fixed on the deck of cards being shuffled by a trembling dealer. Tasha stepped forward, her red and white uniform feeling like a neon sign of poverty in the face of his opulence. She reached out to set a fresh glass of sparkling water and a crystal tumbler beside him. Just as the glass touched the wood, Marco's hand shot out, his fingers brushing against hers. His skin was unnervingly cold. "Tell me, waitress," Marco said, his voice a low, melodic growl that vibrated in Tasha's chest. He finally looked up, his chiseled features twisting into a smirk that didn't reach his predatory eyes. "Does the management at the Gilded Cage recruit from the soup kitchens now? Or did you simply steal that uniform from someone who actually knows how to serve a king?" A few of the men at the table let out a jagged, nervous titter of laughter. Tasha felt the heat rise in her neck, the familiar sting of being belittled for a status she hadn't chosen. She looked him directly in the eye, a move that made the dealer gasp, and saw the flicker of surprise in his expression. "I'm here to do a job, Mr. DiLorenzo," she replied, her voice remarkably calm despite the fire in her gut. "Just like you." Marco leaned back, his eyes narrowing as he took in her defiant posture and the fierce, focused set of her jaw. He let his gaze linger on her worn name tag, a mocking glint in his eyes. "A job? You call carrying a tray a job? You look like you're struggling just to keep your head above the poverty line, Tasha." He enunciated her name with a slow, cruel deliberateness. "Why don't you run along and find me a server who doesn't look like they're one missed paycheck away from a breakdown? You're ruining the aesthetic of my evening." He was testing her, poking at the bruises of her life just to see if she would break. Tasha gripped her tray tighter, her athletic frame tensing under the uniform. She thought of her sister's tuition and her father's face behind the glass. She didn't flinch. She didn't look down. "The aesthetic might be a little rough, sir," she whispered, leaning in just enough so only he could hear. "But the service is honest. Which is more than I can say for some of the people at this table." Marco's smirk vanished, replaced by a dark, intense curiosity. For the first time, he didn't look at her like a piece of furniture. He looked at her like a threat. He opened his mouth to deliver a final, crushing blow to her pride, but his attention was diverted as the dealer began to lay out the first cards of the hand. Marco turned back to the game, dismissing her with a flick of his gold-clad wrist, unaware that the woman he had just mocked was the only thing standing between him and a grave. Tasha forced herself to keep moving, her breath shallow as she retreated toward the shadows of the service station. Marco's mockery still burned like a physical brand on her skin, but she couldn't afford the luxury of pride. Every minute she stayed in this room was a minute closer to the tip money that would keep the lights on for her sister. She watched from a distance as the game intensified, the air in the VIP lounge growing thick with the scent of high-stakes desperation and heavy smoke. A sudden, sharp movement at the table caught her eye. One of the men sitting to Marco's left, a nervous high roller with sweating temples, accidentally swiped his arm across the mahogany, sending a crystal glass of amber liquid tumbling toward the floor. It didn't shatter. The carpet was too thick for that, but it drenched the side of the table and the base of Marco's heavy, gilded chair. "Clean that up. Now," the lead bodyguard, a man named Rico with a face like a scarred fist, barked toward Tasha. Tasha stepped forward, her athletic frame moving with a grace that contradicted her worn uniform. She knelt beside Marco's seat, the hem of her skirt grazing the floor as she pulled a white service cloth from her apron. From this angle, she was practically at Marco's feet. He didn't even look down. He was too busy staring into the eyes of the man across from him, his fingers idly playing with a gold coin. As Tasha reached out to blot the spill near the underside of the table, her hand brushed against something cold, something that wasn't wood or velvet. It was metal. Narrowing her eyes, she leaned in closer, pretending to scrub a stubborn stain on the chair's pedestal. That was when she saw it. Hidden in the intricate carvings of the table's underside, perfectly aligned with the center of Marco's chest, was a modification that didn't belong in any casino. A small, black cylinder, no thicker than a pencil, was taped into a hollowed-out groove. It was connected to a hair-thin wire that snaked down the leg of the table, vanishing into the seam of the carpet right where the guard, Rico, was standing. Tasha's heart did a slow, sickening roll in her chest. She had seen enough of the city's underbelly to recognize a pressurized delivery system. It wasn't a bomb. It was a silent executioner, likely a spring-loaded needle tipped with a neurotoxin. One flick of a switch from the person holding the trigger, and Marco DiLorenzo would be dead before his head hit the felt, appearing to everyone else as a sudden, massive heart attack. A cold sweat broke out across her forehead. She looked up slightly, her gaze traveling from the needle to the wire and then up to Rico's hands. The guard's thumb was resting casually inside his pocket, his knuckles white with tension. He wasn't watching the room for threats. He was watching Marco's hand. He was waiting for a specific moment, perhaps the final reveal of the cards to end the Iron King's reign. Tasha felt the weight of the secret pressing down on her lungs. She looked at Marco's chiseled, arrogant profile. He had just humiliated her. He had called her a ghost, a soup kitchen reject, a nobody. If she stayed silent, if she simply finished cleaning the spill and walked away, the man who had mocked her would be gone, and she would be free to go home to her sister with her pockets full of blood-stained tips. But then she thought of her father. She thought of the haunted look in his eyes when he talked about men who did bad things because they thought they were untouchable. If she let this happen, she wasn't just a waitress. She was an accomplice. The glint of the cold steel needle seemed to pulse in the low light, a tiny, lethal fang waiting to strike. Tasha's hand trembled as she pulled the damp cloth away. She looked at the gold watch on Marco's wrist as he reached out to adjust his cards, his movements confident and unsuspecting. He was a predator, yes, but he was a predator about to be hunted by his own pack. She stood up slowly, her knees shaking. Rico's eyes snapped to hers for a fraction of a second, a predatory, warning glance that told her he knew she had seen too much. The air in the room felt like it had turned to lead. Tasha gripped her empty tray against her chest like a shield, her fierce eyes locking onto the back of Marco's head. She had spent her whole life being invisible, but in this moment, the ghost was the only one who could see the coming storm. Tasha stood slowly, the damp cloth clutched like a cold, heavy stone in her hand. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but she forced her expression to remain a mask of professional boredom. She needed to be invisible just 1 minute longer. As she retreated toward the edge of the VIP lounge, her eyes didn't settle on the diamond-encrusted players or the piles of chips that could buy her family's freedom. Instead, they were locked on Rico. The lead guard stood like a pillar of granite just behind Marco's right shoulder. To anyone else, he looked like the epitome of loyalty, a fierce protector ready to take a bullet for his boss. But from Tasha's new vantage point, the perspective shifted with sickening clarity. Rico wasn't scanning the room for external threats. He wasn't looking at the doors or the other gamblers. His eyes were fixed on Marco's every movement, tracking the way the Mafia boss leaned forward to inspect his cards. As Marco chuckled at a comment from the dealer, his chest moved a fraction of an inch closer to the table's edge, aligning perfectly with the black cylinder Tasha had discovered. In that moment, the shadows of the lounge shifted, and a sliver of golden light hit Rico's face. Tasha felt a chill that had nothing to do with the casino's air conditioning. Rico was smiling. It wasn't a broad, joyful grin. It was a ghost of a smirk, a thin, cruel upturn of the lips that signaled a man who knew he was about to become the new king. His hand remained buried deep in his suit pocket, his thumb moving in a slow, rhythmic circle, the unmistakable motion of someone testing the tension of a trigger. The betrayal was silent, a predatory dance happening right in the center of the room, and no one saw it. The other guards were distracted by a minor dispute at a neighboring baccarat table, and the Iron King himself was too caught up in the thrill of the hand to notice the viper at his back. Tasha realized with a jolt of terror that Rico wasn't just a participant, he was the architect. He was the one who had cleared the room, the one who had positioned the waitress at this specific table, and the one who would likely execute her the moment the needle found its mark to ensure there were no witnesses. Tasha's gaze darted to Marco. For all his arrogance and the way he had mocked her soup kitchen uniform, he was a man being led to the slaughter by the only person he trusted to guard his life. She thought of the Iron King being brought down not by a rival family or a grand war, but by a coward with a hidden wire and a pocketed switch. The air in the lounge grew suffocatingly heavy. Tasha could almost feel the countdown ticking in Rico's head. She looked at her tray, then at the heavy crystal decanter on a nearby sideboard. Her athletic frame tensed, her muscles coiled with a sudden, desperate energy. She was a waitress, a ghost, a nobody from the Bronx. But as she watched Rico's thumb stop its circular motion and press firmly downward against the hidden button, she knew her invisibility had just come to an end. The silence of the betrayal was about to be broken by a scream of defiance. The atmosphere in the lounge tightened, the very air seeming to thicken as the final cards were dealt. Marco DiLorenzo leaned forward, his chiseled face a mask of predatory calm. He didn't look like a man who was about to die. He looked like a king about to expand his empire. With a slow, deliberate movement, he flipped his cards. A straight flush, a hand so dominant that a collective gasp escaped the few spectators permitted in the inner sanctum. "It seems the luck of the Irish isn't with you tonight, Marco purred, his voice a low, melodic rumble. He didn't look at the loser. His winter sea eyes were fixed on the mountain of chips in the center of the table, a pile representing enough wealth to buy Tasha's entire neighborhood. Across the table, the defeated gambler slumped, his face ashen, but Tasha wasn't looking at the cards or the loser. Her gaze was a frantic line of sight between the underside of the table and Rico's hand. The lead guard hadn't moved an inch, but the energy radiating from him was electric, a coiled snake ready to strike. The thin smirk on Rico's face had sharpened into a look of absolute, lethal triumph. Marco reached out. His muscular arm, clad in the fine silk of his tailored suit, extended slowly toward the center of the green felt. The gold watch on his wrist caught the light, ticking away the final seconds of his life. Tasha's heart hammered against her ribs so violently she feared it might burst. She saw it in slow motion, the way Marco's chest squared up with the table's edge, the way his heart, the center of his Iron King persona, lined up perfectly with the black cylinder hidden just inches beneath the wood. If he leaned just 2 inches further to reach the furthest stacks of chips, the pressurized needle would fire. Rico's thumb was no longer moving. It was pressed flat against the trigger in his pocket, his knuckles white, his eyes wide with a manic hunger for the power vacuum that was about to open. Tasha felt the weight of her history pressing on her. She saw her father's face, her sister's future, and the mold-stained walls of the Bronx. She saw the man who had called her a soup kitchen reject, a man who had mocked her very existence. It would be so easy to blink, to turn her head, to let the darkness of the underworld swallow itself whole. But as Marco's fingers grazed the first stack of chips, Tasha saw something else, a flicker of human satisfaction in his eyes, a brief moment of genuine joy before the end. He was a monster, perhaps, but he was a man being murdered by a coward he called a brother. The silence of the room was absolute, broken only by the faint, rhythmic clicking of Rico's thumb finding the final resistance of the trigger. Marco's torso moved forward, his weight shifting onto the table. The alignment was perfect. The trajectory was set. Tasha's empty tray slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the plush carpet, but no one heard it. She took a single, explosive step forward. Her athletic frame, hardened by years of double shifts and the physical grind of poverty, coiled like a spring. She wasn't a waitress anymore. She wasn't an invisible ghost. She was the only variable in a mathematical equation of death, and she was about to break the math. Marco's hand closed around the gold-rimmed chips. Rico's thumb began the final downward press. The glint of cold steel beneath the table was ready to bite. Tasha lunged, her fierce eyes locked onto Marco's shoulder, a scream of warning dying in her throat as she realized words would be too slow. In the world of the Gilded Cage, only action mattered, and Tasha Williams was about to take the most dangerous action of her life. The transition from invisible servant to physical force happened in a heartbeat. Tasha didn't scream. There was no time for breath to become sound. As Marco's chest squared with the lethal edge of the mahogany table, Tasha launched herself forward. Her athletic frame, conditioned by years of carrying heavy trays and the constant, restless movement of the Bronx streets, moved with a sudden, explosive violence that shattered the refined stillness of the VIP lounge. She didn't grab for the tray or the cards. She lunged for the man. Her hand, small but calloused and strong, clamped onto the fine silk of Marco's shoulder, her fingers digging into the hard muscle beneath. With a guttural grunt of effort, she used her entire body weight as a lever. Marco, caught completely off guard in his moment of triumph, had no time to brace himself. His hands were splayed against the chips, his center of gravity forward, making him vulnerable to the sudden, lateral force of her tackle. Tasha yanked him backward and down. The Iron King was ripped from his gilded throne, his boots skidding uselessly across the plush carpet as he was slammed into the floor. The sound of his body hitting the ground was a heavy, dull thud that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards, followed immediately by the sharp, metallic clack of the table's edge being struck by the arm of the chair. For a split second, the world froze. The cards lay scattered, the gold-rimmed chips rained down like plastic hail, and Marco DiLorenzo lay flat on his back, his breath forced from his lungs, his face twisted in a mask of shock and burgeoning fury. Then, the silence broke into 1,000 jagged pieces. "Assassin!" Rico screamed, his voice a calculated, high-pitched roar designed to mask his own failure. He didn't pull his hand from his pocket. Instead, he lunged toward the table, his face a contorted mask of panic as he realized the needle had fired into the empty air where Marco's heart had been a millisecond before. Chaos erupted like a physical explosion. The other guards, conditioned for instant violence, drew their weapons with a symphony of metallic clicks. Women shrieked, diving beneath the baccarat tables as men scrambled for the exits, overturning chairs and shattering crystal carafes. The golden light of the chandeliers seemed to pulse with the sudden, frantic energy of the room. Tasha didn't back away. She stood over the fallen Mafia boss, her red and white uniform wrinkled and strained, her hair beginning to spill from its professional bun. She was gasping for air, her eyes wide and fierce, staring down at the man who had just mocked her existence. Beneath her, Marco was recovering, his hand reaching for the holster at his hip, his eyes burning with a murderous wintersea light. He didn't see the threat beneath the table. He only saw the waitress who had dared to touch him. The barrels of a dozen guns swiveled toward her, the cold, black eyes of the muzzles promising a quick and violent end. Tasha stood her ground in the center of the storm, a lone figure of defiance in a world of gold and blood, the only person in the room who knew that the chaos she had just unleashed was the only thing keeping the king alive. The heavy thud of Marco's body hitting the floor was instantly drowned out by the metallic chorus of a dozen slides being racked. Tasha didn't have time to scramble back. She was frozen in the center of a lethal circle, the air suddenly thick with the smell of gun oil and the cold, predatory intent of men trained to kill without hesitation. Marco lay pinned beneath the weight of his own shock, his hand clawing at the carpet as he gasped for the air she had knocked out of him. His chiseled face was no longer a mask of aristocratic boredom. It was twisted into a snarl of primal rage. He looked up at her from the floor, his winter-sea eyes burning with a promise of slow, agonizing retribution. Above him, the guards, led by a frantic, wide-eyed Rico, had formed a wall of suits and steel. The muzzle of Rico's Glock was inches from Tasha's forehead, the black void of the barrel looking like an entrance to the grave. His hand was shaking, not from fear of her, but from the desperate need to finish what he had started before the truth could emerge. "Don't move, you rat," Rico roared, his voice cracking with a manufactured fury. "I'll blow your head across the room." "Wait," Marco rasped from the floor, his voice returning in a jagged edge. He pushed himself up onto one elbow, glaring at Tasha as if she were a stain he needed to scrub from the world. "No one kills her yet. I want to hear why a ghost thought she could touch a king." The room was a pressure cooker of violence, the silence between breaths taut enough to snap. Tasha's athletic frame was rigid, her heart drumming against her ribs like a trapped bird, but she didn't lower her gaze. She could see the sweat beading on Rico's upper lip. She could see his thumb twitching near his pocket. "Look at the table," Tasha screamed, her voice cracking through the tension like a whip. "Look at the table, you fools." Rico's eyes flared with panic. "She's trying to distract us. Finish her." "I said wait," Marco bellowed, the sheer authority in his voice freezing every finger on every trigger. He looked at Tasha, really looked at her, seeing the fierce, unyielding light in her eyes that didn't belong to a common assassin. He followed her trembling finger, which was pointed directly at the mahogany pedestal of the high-stakes table. Tasha's voice was a frantic, desperate prayer. "Under the edge, beside the leg where Rico was standing, look at the modification." Marco's gaze shifted. He was a man who had survived a dozen betrayals by noticing the things others missed. He lowered his shoulder, peering beneath the gold-trimmed edge of the table. There, in the dim, fractured light of the chandeliers, he saw it. The small, black cylinder and the single, spent needle that had fired into the empty space where his heart had been a second before. The silence that followed was different than before. It wasn't the silence of fear. It was the silence of a predator realizing he had been marked for slaughter by his own pack. Marco's eyes traveled slowly up the thin, nearly invisible wire that snaked through the carpet, tracing its path directly to the spot where Rico's polished leather shoes were planted. Rico's face went from the color of ash to the color of bone. The Glock in his hand suddenly felt like a lead weight. "Rico," Marco said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was more terrifying than any shout. He stood up slowly, brushing the dust from his tailored black suit with a terrifying, rhythmic precision. He didn't look at the gun pointed at Tasha anymore. He looked at his oldest friend. "Why is there a trigger in your pocket?" Tasha felt the barrel of the gun waver, and then drop as Rico's knees finally gave way. The circle of guards shifted, their loyalty swinging like a compass needle toward the man who truly owned them. Tasha stood in the center, her red and white uniform a beacon of truth in a room full of golden lies, watching as the Iron King turned his gaze from the traitor to the waitress who had just gambled her life to save his. The air in the VIP lounge was so thick with tension that it felt as though the slightest sound would shatter the world. Rico was trembling, his face a ghostly mask of sweat and terror, while the Glock in his hand weighed more than he could carry. Marco DiLorenzo stood like a statue carved from obsidian, his winter-sea eyes fixed on the man he had called his brother. "Step back from the table," Marco commanded, his voice a low, lethal vibration. He didn't look at the guards. He didn't look at the frightened socialites hiding beneath the velvet. He reached out and grabbed the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning white as he tilted the massive piece of wood upward. The gold-rimmed chips cascaded to the floor like a waterfall of broken promises, revealing the belly of the beast. There, exposed in the harsh light of the diamond chandeliers, was the intricate machinery of death. The pressurized canister hummed with a faint, dying hiss, and the black cylinder sat empty, its payload already spent. Marco reached out, his gloved hand tracing the wire that led directly to the spot where Rico had been standing. With a sudden, violent jerk, Marco ripped the mechanism from the wood. "You were going to let me die over a card game, Rico?" Marco asked, the betrayal tasting like ash in his mouth. "Marco, please, they threatened my family. I had no choice." Rico's voice was a pathetic whine, but the Iron King was no longer listening. Marco turned his head toward the wall. "Fire it." One of Marco's loyalist guards stepped forward and triggered the manual override on the device's casing. A faint thwip sounded through the room, a noise so small it was terrifying. A second needle, tipped with a glistening, viscous green liquid, slammed into a nearby leather chair. Within seconds, the thick hide began to smoke and hiss, the neurotoxin melting the material with corrosive intensity. Marco's anger, which had been a hot, roiling flame, suddenly turned into a cold, paralyzing shock. He stared at the chair, then at the spot where his own heart would have been if Tasha hadn't tackled him. He realized then that it wasn't just a heart attack they wanted. They wanted to ensure there was no coming back. They wanted him erased. He turned slowly toward Tasha. She was still standing there, her red and white uniform torn at the shoulder, her chest heaving with the remnants of adrenaline. She looked small against the backdrop of the Gilded Cage, yet she was the only thing in the room that felt solid. "You saw it," Marco whispered, the shock finally cracking his aristocratic mask. "While I was mocking you, while I was calling you a ghost, you were watching the shadow at my back." He looked at her calloused hands, hands that carried trays and scrubbed floors, and realized they were the hands that had just pulled him from the mouth of hell. The Iron King, a man who believed that loyalty was something you bought and fear was something you sowed, felt a sudden, sharp pang of something he hadn't felt in decades: genuine, unpayable debt. Rico made a move to run, but he was tackled by 4 guards before he reached the heavy velvet curtains. Marco didn't even look at the traitor as they dragged him toward the basement. His focus was entirely on the black waitress who had defied the rules of his world. "Rico was right about one thing," Marco said, his voice regaining its strength but losing its cruelty. "He called you a rat, but he was wrong. You're the only person in this room who isn't a coward." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a silk handkerchief, stepping toward Tasha. The guards held their breath, unsure of what the king would do next. Marco reached out, and for the first time, his touch wasn't cold. He gently wiped a smudge of soot from her cheek, his chiseled features softening into an expression that was almost human. "I told you to lift your head earlier, Tasha Williams," he said, his voice echoing in the silent lounge. "Now I'm telling the rest of the world to do the same, because from this moment on, no one is allowed to look down on you again." Tasha didn't blink. She didn't thank him. She simply met his gaze with the same fierce, focused light that had saved his life. The debt of blood had been paid, and as the chaos of the night began to settle, the transformation of Tasha Williams and the Iron King himself had only just begun. The morning air in the Bronx was thick with the smell of damp concrete and the distant, rhythmic rumble of the elevated train. Tasha sat at her small kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of lukewarm coffee that offered little comfort. Her red and white uniform hung on the back of the chair, the shoulder still torn, a jagged reminder of the night that felt like a fever dream. The silence in the apartment was heavy. Her sister was asleep, and the vacancy of her father's chair in the corner felt like a physical ache. She was waiting for the inevitable, the police, the debt collectors, or perhaps the men in black suits coming to finish what Rico had started. When the black sedan pulled up to the curb of her crumbling tenement building, it didn't screech its tires. It glided to a halt like a silent predator. Tasha stood up, her athletic frame tensing, her eyes fixing on the door. She didn't hide. She didn't run. She walked to the window and watched as Marco DiLorenzo stepped out. He looked out of place against the backdrop of graffiti and rusted fire escapes, his tailored suit a sharp, dark blade cutting through the gray morning light. He didn't knock. His lead security detail held the door open as he ascended the narrow, creaking stairs. When he reached her door, Tasha opened it before he could raise a hand. They stood in the doorway of her cramped world, the Iron King and the invisible waitress, and for a moment, the only sound was the drip of the leaky faucet in the sink. "You have a habit of looking people in the eye, Tasha Williams," Marco said, his voice low and devoid of the mockery that had defined their first meeting. He stepped into the room, his gaze taking in the peeling wallpaper, the stacks of legal documents on the counter, and the flickering light bulb. He didn't look at the poverty with disgust. He looked at it with the clinical precision of a man calculating a debt. "I don't have much else to give, Mr. DiLorenzo," Tasha replied, her voice steady. "If you're here because of the casino, I told the police everything I knew. I didn't take anything." "I know what you took," Marco said, reaching into the inner pocket of his coat. "You took a bullet meant for me. You took a betrayal that should have ended my life. And in my world, we don't leave those accounts unsettled." He placed a thick manila envelope on the scarred wooden table. Tasha hesitated, then reached out, her fingers trembling slightly as she pulled out the contents. The first document was a heavy, cream-colored parchment with a gold seal, the deed to her family home, stamped paid in full. The second was a set of legal papers, signed by a federal judge, bearing her father's name. "The foreclosure was halted an hour ago," Marco stated, his Wintersea eyes watching her face. "The bank has been compensated for their trouble, and the deed is now in your name. As for your father, it turns out that when the right people ask the right questions, evidence has a way of appearing. He's being processed for release as we speak. There's a car waiting at the precinct to bring him here." Tasha felt the air leave her lungs. The room seemed to tilt, the weight of the last 3 years, the double shifts, the cold nights, the haunted look in her father's eyes, suddenly lifting so fast it made her lightheaded. She looked at the papers. Then at the man who had been a monster in her eyes, only hours before. "Why?" she whispered, her fierce gaze finally breaking as a single tear escaped. "You don't owe me this much." "You saved the life of a man who didn't deserve it," Marco said, stepping closer until he was mere inches away. He reached out, his hand hovering near her shoulder before he let it drop. "In a city full of people who would kill for a seat at my table, you're the only one who didn't want anything from me. That makes you the most powerful person I've ever met." He turned to leave, but stopped at the threshold. "I'm opening a foundation, Tasha, a community justice initiative. It needs someone who knows what it's like to be invisible, someone who isn't afraid to take down a king if it means doing what's right." He glanced back, a faint, genuine smirk touching his chiseled features. "The salary is significantly better than the Gilded Cage. I'll expect you on Monday." As the black sedan pulled away, Tasha stood in the center of her kitchen, the morning sun finally breaking through the Bronx haze and hitting the papers on the table. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She wasn't just a waitress in a worn uniform. The world had tried to break her, but she had stood her ground, and in doing so, she had changed the tide of her fate. What happened next wouldn't just blow people's minds, it would build a legacy. For the first time in her life, Tasha Williams sat down, closed her eyes, and breathed in the scent of a future that finally belonged to her. A single choice turned a waitress into a queen. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of the heroes hidden in plain sight. Don't forget to turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what happens in our next story. Thanks for watching.